Officer, I was attempting to remind you of the legal boundaries of your authority to prevent the violation of my constitutional rights.
You want me to articulate something? You want to talk about rights? I'm articulating that you're getting out of this car right now, or I will pull you out. Is that specific enough for you, Your Honor?
The afternoon sun of late spring cast long, lazy shadows across the polished black hood of the Mercedes S-Class. Inside, the quiet hum of the engine was a soft counterpoint to the smooth jazz flowing from the Burmester sound system. At the wheel, Judge Arthur Hayes allowed himself a rare moment of pure, uncluttered peace. His hands, which hours earlier had held the weight of a landmark civil rights ruling, now rested lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. At 58, his hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, his face lined with the quiet intensity of a man who spent his days weighing the complexities of human behavior. But now, cruising down the wide, clean lanes of the suburban parkway, he was just Arthur, a man heading home after a long, consequential week. He thought back to the courtroom, to the palpable tension that had filled the air as he read his decision. It was a case involving discriminatory housing practices, a knot of legal and social threads he had spent months untangling. His ruling in favor of the plaintiffs had sent ripples through the city's political establishment. He knew it would be controversial, that the comfortable and the powerful would decry it as judicial activism. But the law, as he saw it, was clear. His job wasn't to be popular, it was to be just. He had taken an oath to uphold a constitution that promised equality, and today he had honored that oath. A quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him, as solid and reassuring as the heavy oak of his bench. He signaled and moved into the left lane to pass a slower-moving truck, the powerful sedan responding with effortless grace. He enjoyed driving. It was one of the few times he felt disconnected from the immense pressures of his profession. On the road, the rules were simple. Stay in your lane, signal your intentions, respect the space of others. It was a world away from the labyrinthine corridors of legal precedent and moral ambiguity. Here, there was just the asphalt, the sky, and the quiet solitude of his car. He glanced at the passenger seat where his briefcase sat. It contained not just legal documents, but also a small, worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book he'd turned to for guidance since his law school days. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. The thought drifted through his mind, a quiet echo of the Stoic philosophy that had become his anchor. The parkway was beginning to thin out as the midday traffic rush subsided. Trees lined the road, their leaves a vibrant green against a brilliant blue sky. It was a beautiful day, the kind that made you feel grateful to be alive. He adjusted his sunglasses, thinking about the evening ahead. His wife, Sarah, was making his favorite dish, braised short ribs. They would eat on the patio, talk about their respective days, and for a few hours, the weighty title of the Honorable Arthur Hayes would be replaced by the simple, cherished one of husband. He smiled at the thought. After 30 years of marriage, these small moments of domestic tranquility were what he valued most. They were the ballast that kept him steady through the storms of his professional life. He was a man of immense public power, yet his greatest happiness was found in the quiet, private sphere of his home. As he rounded a long, gentle curve, he checked his rearview mirror out of habit. A white police cruiser, a Ford Explorer, was a few car lengths behind him. He didn't think anything of it. Police presence on this stretch of road was common. He maintained his speed, a steady 5 miles over the limit, the accepted flow of traffic. He was a man who believed in order, in rules, in the structure that society needed to function. He respected law enforcement, understood the difficult and dangerous job they performed every day. He had sent countless criminals to prison based on the diligent work of good officers. The sight of the cruiser was, to him, a comforting one, a sign that the system was at work. He continued driving, lost in his thoughts of dinner and the quiet evening to come, completely unaware that in that cruiser, the system he so deeply believed in was about to be turned against him. He was a federal judge, a pillar of the community, a man who had dedicated his life to the impartial application of justice. But in the next few moments, none of that would matter. All that would matter was the color of his skin and the price of his car. Inside the patrol unit, Officer Ryan Vance's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. He was 34, with a bulldog jaw, and the kind of restless, predatory eyes that were always scanning, always looking for a reason. Beside him, his partner, Officer Mike Dolan, was younger by nearly a decade, still possessing a measure of the idealism that Vance had long since shed and replaced with a hardened, cynical worldview. Vance's gaze was fixed on the black Mercedes gliding smoothly ahead of them. It was the car that had caught his eye first, sleek, expensive, foreign. Then he saw the driver, a black man. And for Vance, the two things together formed a conclusion as quick and damning as a gunshot. "Look at that," Vance muttered, his voice a low growl of resentment. "Bet that costs more than my house." Dolan glanced over. "It's a nice car," he said, his tone neutral. "Probably a doctor or a lawyer." Vance let out a short, derisive snort. "Yeah, or something else. Guys like that in cars like that, they're always dirty." It wasn't a suspicion. It was a statement of fact in Vance's world. He saw the world in stark, simple terms. There were cops, and there were perps. And a black man in a six-figure car on this side of town fell squarely into the second category. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of his service weapon, a simmering anger at a world he felt had passed him by, rewarding others with unearned success while he was stuck writing traffic tickets and dealing with society's refuse. That Mercedes was a symbol of everything he felt he was entitled to, but couldn't have. "He's not even speeding," Dolan noted, watching their own speedometer. "Just keeping with traffic." Vance's eyes narrowed. He was hunting now, searching for an excuse, a crack in the driver's perfect adherence to the law. He saw the Mercedes signal and move left to pass a truck. For a fraction of a second, as the car completed the maneuver and settled back into the right lane, its left side tires kissed the yellow line dividing the lanes. It was nothing. 1,000 other drivers did it every hour, but for Vance, it was the opening he needed. "There it is," he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Failure to maintain lane. That's our boy." He flicked a switch on the console, and the cruiser's light bar exploded in a silent cascade of red and blue. He gunned the engine, closing the distance to the Mercedes in seconds. Dolan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ryan, that was pretty thin. He was just going around a semi." "Thin is all I need," Vance shot back, his authority absolute in the confines of the car. "You just watch and learn, kid. This is how you do real police work. You don't wait for them to break the big laws. You get them on the little stuff. You pull the thread and the whole sweater unravels." The Mercedes signaled immediately and pulled over to the shoulder, its movements calm and controlled. There was no hesitation, no sudden braking, just a smooth, compliant stop. For some officers, that would have been a sign that the driver was likely a law-abiding citizen. For Vance, it was a sign of arrogance, as if the driver thought he was too good to be flustered. "All right, here we go," Vance said, unbuckling his seatbelt. He put his hand on his sidearm, not drawing it, but letting it rest there, a casual promise of violence. "I'll take the driver's side, you take passenger. Watch his hands. Watch everything." Dolan nodded, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He'd been partnered with Vance for 6 months, and he'd seen this look in his partner's eyes before. It was a look that meant the stop was no longer about the traffic infraction. It was about dominance. It was about proving a point. As they stepped out of the cruiser into the bright afternoon sun, the idyllic scene of a tree-lined parkway was transformed into a stage. The roles had been cast long before the lights were ever turned on, and as Vance walked toward the driver's side window, his stride filled with a confident, aggressive swagger, Dolan had the sinking feeling that no matter what happened next, the ending had already been written in his partner's mind. Judge Hayes watched the officer approach in his side view mirror. The man was built like a linebacker with a tense, forward-leaning posture that screamed aggression. His hand was resting on his holstered firearm. The judge's years on the bench had taught him to read people, and his internal alarm, usually silent, began to hum with a low-level warning. He had already powered down his window and placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, palms open and visible. It was a gesture of compliance he had seen countless times in police training videos, and one he hoped would de-escalate whatever was about to happen. Officer Vance arrived at the window, his shadow falling over the judge. He didn't greet him. He didn't introduce himself. He just stared, his eyes scanning the interior of the car, lingering on the fine leather and polished wood trim before finally settling on the judge's face. "You know why I pulled you over?" Vance's voice was clipped, confrontational. "I'm afraid I don't, officer," Judge Hayes replied, his own voice calm and even. He made a point of looking directly at the officer's name tag. Vance. "I believe I was observing the speed limit and staying with the flow of traffic." Vance's lip curled into a slight sneer. "You failed to maintain your lane back there, swerved right over the double yellow." The judge considered this. He knew he hadn't. He had touched the line, perhaps, but a swerve? That was a deliberate mischaracterization. "I see," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I had just moved to pass a semi-truck. I believe I was well within my lane for the entire maneuver." He wasn't arguing. He was stating a fact, a piece of his testimony should it be needed. "Is that so?" Vance said, leaning in closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, I saw what I saw. License and registration." "Of course." The judge maintained his steady tone. "My wallet is in my jacket pocket on the passenger seat, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, very slowly." "Just keep your hands where I can see 'em," Vance barked. As Judge Hayes leaned over, Officer Dolan appeared at the passenger window, peering in, his presence adding another layer of intimidation to the encounter. The judge retrieved his wallet and the vehicle's registration from the glove box. He pulled out his driver's license and, alongside it, his federal judicial identification. He held both out to Vance. He hoped the judicial ID would clarify the situation, end this unnecessary charade, and allow everyone to get on with their day. It was not a card he played often, but in a situation predicated on a false assumption, he felt the truth was the most efficient tool. Vance took the two cards, barely glancing at the driver's license. His eyes locked onto the federal ID. He saw the official seal, the photograph, the words, "Judge, United States District Court." For a fleeting moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But it was immediately replaced by a look of profound skepticism, which quickly hardened back into contempt. "This is a good one," Vance said, holding the ID between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage. He showed it to Dolan through the open window. "Look at this, Mike. We got ourselves a federal judge." He said the words with heavy air quotes, his tone mocking. Judge Hayes remained perfectly still, his hands back on the steering wheel. The officer's reaction was more telling than any verbal threat. He wasn't just questioning the ID's authenticity. He was rejecting the very possibility that a man like Arthur Hayes could hold such a position. "Officer, that is my official identification," the judge said, his voice losing none of its composure, though a cold knot of dread was forming in his stomach. "If you'd like to verify it, my name is Arthur Hayes. You can run it through your system. You'll find it's quite valid." "Oh, I'll run it," Vance said, his eyes glinting with malice. "But first, you're going to step out of the car." "For what reason?" the judge asked, his legal mind automatically cataloging the procedural violations. "You have my license and registration. A lane violation is a simple citation. There is no cause for me to exit my vehicle." "I'm telling you to step out of the car. That's the reason," Vance said, his voice rising, the pretense of a traffic stop now completely gone. "Now!" His hand moved from resting on his gun to gripping the handle. The implied threat was now an explicit one. This was no longer about traffic law. It was about power. And Officer Vance was determined to prove who had it. The air grew thick with unspoken challenge. Judge Hayes met Officer Vance's glare not with defiance, but with the steady, unwavering gaze of a man accustomed to deconstructing arguments and finding the flaws in their foundation. He understood the legal precipice they were on. A traffic stop was one thing. An order to exit the vehicle without cause was a significant escalation, a step that required reasonable suspicion of a greater crime or a threat to officer safety. Neither was present here. "Officer," he began again, his tone that of a patient educator rather than a victim. "Under Pennsylvania v. Mims, I understand you can order me out of the vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. However, the initial pretext for this stop was, at best, tenuous. I would prefer to remain in my vehicle unless you can articulate a specific, reasonable suspicion that I am armed or involved in criminal activity." Vance's face darkened with rage. The judge's calm recitation of case law was not just a challenge, it was an insult. It was this man, this driver in his fancy car, telling him how to do his job. It was an intellectual jab that Vance could only answer with brute force. "You want me to articulate something?" Vance snarled, leaning so close the judge could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I'm articulating that you're getting out of this car right now, or I'm going to pull you out. Is that specific enough for you, Your Honor?" The mockery was a clear signal. This had become personal. Judge Hayes made a calculated decision. Resisting physically was out of the question. It would only lead to violence and give these officers the justification they were so clearly seeking. The battle would have to be won later, in a different arena. He would comply, but he would do so under protest. "I am exiting the vehicle under duress and against my will," he stated, his voice clear and formal, each word a stone being laid for a future legal case. "I am not consenting to this action." He moved to open the door, but before he could, Vance did something that shocked even Officer Dolan. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the judge's driver's license and his federal ID back through the open window. They fluttered down onto the passenger seat like discarded napkins. It was an act of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a non-verbal declaration that the judge's identity, his status, his entire life's work meant nothing. It was a symbolic stripping of his authority, an attempt to reduce him to nothing more than a suspect. Judge Hayes watched the cards land. A deep, cold anger, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, settled deep in his bones. It was not the hot, impulsive anger of a street fight, but the cold, focused fury of a man whose fundamental principles had been violated. He had been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and for the last 12 years a federal judge. He had dedicated his entire adult life to the sanctity of the law and the institutions that upheld it. And this officer, with one careless, arrogant gesture, had just spit on all of it. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Hayes pushed his door open and stood up. He was a tall man, and as he rose to his full height, he was nearly eye to eye with Vance. He made sure to keep his hands away from his body, open and visible. The afternoon sun felt hot on his face. The sound of traffic rushing past on the parkway seemed distant, like the roar of a faraway ocean. The world had narrowed to this small strip of asphalt, to the two officers in front of him, and the profound injustice of the moment. "Turn around," Vance commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Hands behind your back." "Am I being placed under arrest?" the judge asked, his voice steady despite the tremor of rage he felt inside. "You're being detained," Vance snapped. "Now turn around before I make you." As Judge Hayes complied, turning to face his own car, he caught a glimpse of Dolan's face. The younger officer's expression was a mixture of anxiety and something that looked like shame. He knew this was wrong. He knew they had crossed a line, but he said nothing. His silence was his consent, his complicity an anchor weighing them all down. The judge understood in that moment that the greatest facilitator of injustice isn't always overt malice, but often the quiet cowardice of those who know better and fail to act. With his back to the officers, Judge Hayes felt a profound sense of vulnerability. The world was now behind him. All he could see was the gleaming black paint of his Mercedes, his own distorted reflection staring back at him. He saw a man in a fine suit, a man who had commanded a courtroom just hours before, now standing on the side of a highway, about to be stripped of his liberty. The irony was a bitter pill. He had spent his career sending people into custody, but always after due process, after evidence was presented and arguments were heard. This was the opposite. This was power without process, punishment without a crime. Vance grabbed his wrists with a roughness that was entirely unnecessary. The judge did not resist, keeping his muscles relaxed, offering no tension for Vance to fight against. He had seen enough resisting arrest cases to know how quickly an officer's narrative could be built around a suspect's slightest physical reaction. He would give them nothing. His compliance would be his weapon. The cold, unforgiving metal of the handcuffs closed around his right wrist, then his left. The double click of the locking mechanism was unnaturally loud in the open air, a sound of finality. Each click was a punctuation mark in the sentence of his humiliation. The cuffs were ratcheted down too tightly, biting into the flesh around his wrists. He could feel his pulse throbbing against the steel. A wave of claustrophobia washed over him, but he pushed it down, focusing on his breathing, on the stoic principles that had always guided him. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. "Officer, the handcuffs are excessively tight," he stated, not as a complaint, but as a factual observation for the record he was building in his mind. "They're fine," Vance grunted, giving the cuffs a final, painful tug. He then placed a hand on the back of the judge's head, a gesture of absolute dominance. "Watch your head," he said, the standard procedural phrase made sinister by the preceding aggression. He was being led toward the back of the police cruiser. As he walked, he saw that traffic on the parkway had started to slow. Driving were turning their heads, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Then he saw it. A woman in the passenger seat of a minivan, her smartphone held up, its small black lens pointed directly at them. Another driver, a young man in a pickup truck, did the same. The red dot of a recording light was a small beacon in the afternoon haze. A strange sense of relief mixed with the anger. This was no longer just his word against theirs. There were witnesses. The unblinking, impartial eye of the camera was now part of the proceedings. Vance saw the phones too, and it only seemed to fuel his anger. He shoved the judge forward slightly. "Get in the car, now!" Judge Hayes had to duck awkwardly to get into the back of the SUV, his cuffed hands making the movement clumsy and undignified. The back of the cruiser was a cage of hard plastic and metal grating. The seat was molded and unforgiving, designed for compliance, not comfort. The door slammed shut with a heavy, hollow thud, sealing him inside. The air was hot and smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. He sat there, blinking in the dim light, and looked out through the reinforced window. He could see Vance and Dolan talking near his car. Vance was gesturing angrily, his face flushed. Dolan was shaking his head, his posture defensive. The silent argument was clear. Dolan was having second thoughts, and Vance was bullying him back into line. From his caged perspective, the world outside looked surreal. The sun was still shining. The trees were still green. People were still driving home from work, living their ordinary lives. But his life, in the span of less than 10 minutes, had become anything but ordinary. He was no longer a judge. He was a prisoner in the back of a police car, his fate in the hands of two men who had already judged him guilty on sight. The clicks of the handcuffs echoed in his mind, a cold, metallic rhythm counting down the seconds of his stolen freedom. Locked in the back of the cruiser, Judge Hayes focused his mind, pushing past the initial shock and humiliation. He began to systematically analyze his situation, not as a victim, but as the legal scholar he was. The stop was pretextual. The order to exit the vehicle was unlawful. The search, which he now saw Dolan beginning to conduct on his car, was non-consensual and without probable cause. The arrest itself was without foundation. He had a mountain of procedural violations to work with. But first, he needed to assert his fundamental rights. Vance finally finished his tense conversation with Dolan and strode back to the cruiser, yanking open the rear door. "We're going to have a little chat on the way to the precinct," he said, his tone suggesting it would be more of an interrogation than a chat. Judge Hayes looked directly at him, his eyes clear and resolute. "Before you ask me any questions, I want to be clear," he said, his voice resonating with the authority it carried in his own courtroom. "I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Furthermore, I am invoking my Sixth Amendment right to counsel. I will not answer any questions, and I demand to speak with my attorney immediately." Vance stared at him, his mouth tightening into a thin, angry line. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He was used to fear, to frantic denials, to desperate bargaining. He was not used to a calm, precise recitation of constitutional rights from a man in handcuffs. It was another challenge, another way this man was refusing to play the part of the common criminal. "You can call your lawyer from the station, hotshot," Vance sneered. "Right now you're in my custody, and you'll talk when I tell you to talk." "That is a direct violation of my Miranda rights, Officer Vance," the judge stated calmly. "Any statement I make from this point forward would be inadmissible, as it would be the product of an illegal custodial interrogation." The legal jargon seemed to enrage Vance further. It was a language he didn't fully command, and it was being used as a shield against his authority. He reached in, grabbed the judge by the upper arm, and hauled him back out of the car. The sudden movement was jarring, pulling at the judge's shoulders, which were already strained by the tight cuffs. "What did you say to me?" Vance demanded, his face inches from the judge's. "I said I am invoking my right to an attorney," Judge Hayes repeated, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to show fear. That was the final straw. For Vance, this entire encounter had been a battle of wills, and he was losing. In a blind surge of fury and frustration, he shoved the judge with all his strength. Judge Hayes, off balance and with his hands cuffed behind him, had no way to break his fall. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him directly into the side of his own Mercedes. The impact was brutal. The right side of his face and his shoulder slammed into the solid metal of the car's hood. A starburst of pain exploded behind his eye, and he felt the sharp, metallic taste of blood in his mouth from a cut on his lip. The world tilted for a second, the bright afternoon sun blurring into a painful glare. He braced himself against the hood, gasping for breath, the pain radiating down his arm. He could hear a woman's voice from one of the stopped cars yelling, "Hey! He wasn't doing anything! I'm filming this!" The sound seemed to snap Vance out of his rage. He looked around wildly, his eyes wide, as if just now realizing the severity of what he'd done. He had just assaulted a detained, handcuffed man in full view of multiple witnesses with recording cameras. Dolan rushed over, his face pale with panic. "Ryan, what are you doing?" Dolan hissed, grabbing his partner's arm. Vance just stared at the judge, who was now pushing himself upright, his breathing ragged. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth down his chin. He turned his head and looked at Vance. His expression was not one of fear or anger. It was one of profound, sorrowful gravity. In that moment, he looked every bit the judge, and Vance looked like nothing more than a common thug. "This assault has been noted, officer," Judge Hayes said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a 10-ton verdict. "And it has been recorded." He nodded his head slightly toward the bystanders. Vance's bravado finally shattered, replaced by the cold, creeping dread of consequence. He had lost control. He had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. And he had done it all while his own body camera, the unblinking eye on his chest, was recording every single second of his career's implosion. The shove had changed everything. The raw physical violence had stripped away the last veneer of a legitimate police action. Dolan, now clearly terrified, practically bundled Judge Hayes back into the cruiser, his movements frantic and clumsy. Vance stood frozen for a moment longer, staring at the small dent his assault had left on the Mercedes's hood, a permanent marker of his transgression. Then, with a curse muttered under his breath, he got back into the driver's seat. The drive to the precinct was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. In the front, the previous smugness was gone, replaced by a tense, panicked energy. Dolan kept glancing back at the judge, his face a mask of regret and fear. Vance stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. The radio, which had been humming with the routine chatter of the day, was now an accuser, its silence a testament to the abnormality of their situation. They both knew they were supposed to call in the arrest, to report the use of force. They did neither. Their silence was a conspiracy, a desperate, unspoken agreement to try and contain a fire that was already raging out of control. In the back, Judge Hayes was a study in stillness. He sat upright against the hard plastic, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder and the sting on his lip. He was no longer thinking about the injustice of the moment. His mind had moved on to the mechanics of the future. He was mentally composing his formal complaint, outlining the civil rights lawsuit that would inevitably follow. He cataloged every detail with judicial precision. The fabricated traffic violation, the refusal to verify his identity, the unlawful order to exit the vehicle, the illegal search of his car, the contemptuous dismissal of his credentials, the excessively tight handcuffs, the denial of his right to counsel, and finally, the assault. He watched the suburban landscape slide by the window, manicured lawns, sprawling houses, the very picture of the American dream. It was a world he was a part of, a world he had sworn to protect through the application of law and order. Yet he had just experienced the brutal reality that for some, that order was a weapon, not a shield. His race and his perceived wealth had made him a target, erasing his decades of service, his character, his very humanity in the eyes of Officer Vance. He thought of the young men and women who had stood before him in his courtroom, telling similar stories of police encounters gone wrong. He had always listened with a sympathetic but critical ear, weighing their testimony against the official reports of the officers. He had tried to be fair, to see both sides. But now, for the first time, he was living their reality. He felt the helplessness, the powerlessness that came from being on the wrong side of the badge, where the truth was whatever the officer decided it was. This experience, as painful and humiliating as it was also a lesson. It was a brutal first-hand education in the very injustices he had spent his career fighting from the bench. As the cruiser pulled into the sally port of the precinct, the heavy steel doors rolling shut behind them, the finality of his situation set in. He was entering the belly of the beast. Here, in this concrete and steel box, Vance and Dolan would have the home field advantage. They would write their report, crafting a narrative that painted him as the aggressor, as non-compliant, as a threat. They would rely on the institutional bias that often gave an officer's word more weight than a citizen's. But they were making a fatal miscalculation. They assumed he was just another citizen. They had no idea that the man they were about to book for resisting arrest was a master of the very system they were trying to manipulate. The battle on the roadside was over. The war in the courthouse was just beginning. The air inside the precinct was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the warm spring day outside. The smell of industrial cleaner and old paper hung in the air. Vance and Dolan led Judge Hayes through a series of anonymous hallways, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum floors. Other officers glanced at them, their faces impassive. To them, the judge was just another perp, another body to be processed. The suit, the expensive shoes, the air of quiet dignity, it all just made him a different flavor of criminal in their eyes. They arrived at the booking desk, a high counter lorded over by a burly, bored-looking sergeant with a thick mustache and a nameplate that read, Kowalski. "What do we have here, Vance?" Kowalski asked without looking up from his computer screen. "Resisting arrest, failure to comply, and that lane violation to start," Vance said, his voice regaining some of its earlier swagger now that he was back on his home turf. He shoved a preliminary arrest form across the counter. Kowalski finally looked up, his eyes taking in the judge's bloodied lip and expensive suit. He grunted, a sound of mild interest. "Looks like he gave you some trouble." "You could say that," Vance lied easily. "I did not resist," Judge Hayes said, his voice clear and steady. I was assaulted. Kowalski's eyes narrowed, not with concern, but with annoyance at the interruption. Nobody's talking to you, he grumbled, turning his attention back to the form. All right, let's get this done. Empty your pockets, put everything in the tray. Because his hands were still cuffed behind him, Dolan had to awkwardly pat him down, pulling out his wallet, his keys, his phone. The items were unceremoniously dumped into a gray plastic tray. Next came the belt, the tie, the shoelaces, standard procedure to prevent self-harm, but in this context, each removal felt like another layer of his identity being peeled away. His tailored suit jacket was taken off, leaving him in just his dress shirt, which was now rumpled and stained with a small speck of blood. Name? Kowalski asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. Arthur Hayes. Spell it. The judge did so, patiently. The irony was almost too much to bear. His name was engraved on plaques, printed on judicial orders that shaped the lives of thousands. Here, it was just a series of letters to be typed into a database. All right, Arthur, look at the camera, Kowalski ordered, gesturing toward a small camera mounted on the wall. A harsh flash went off, capturing his image for a mugshot. He stared into the lens, his expression carefully neutral, betraying none of the cold fury within. He knew this photo would become part of the public record, and he would not give them the satisfaction of capturing him looking defeated. Next came the fingerprinting. He was led to a digital scanner, and Dolan had to uncuff one hand at a time to press each of his fingers onto the glass plate. The process was impersonal, dehumanizing. These were the hands that had signed legal opinions, shaken the hands of senators, and held his wife's for 30 years. Now, they were being reduced to a set of whorls and ridges in a criminal database. Through it all, he remained silent, his mind a fortress of composure. He knew that every indignity was a potential exhibit in his future case. The booking process was a well-oiled machine designed to intimidate and disorient. It was meant to make a person feel small, powerless, and alone. It was designed to make them forget who they were outside those walls. But they couldn't make Arthur Hayes forget who he was. As he was led to a small, concrete holding cell, the heavy metal door clanging shut behind him, he was not just a prisoner. He was a federal judge, and he was taking notes. He looked around the cell, the steel bench, the grimy toilet, the faint scratches of graffiti on the walls. This was the end point of the legal system for so many. For him, it was just the beginning. He sat down on the cold bench, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary ache. But beneath the exhaustion, his resolve was hardening like steel. They had stripped him of his suit, his possessions, and his freedom, but they could not touch his mind. And in his mind, the case of the United States v. Vance and Dolan was already being prepared for trial. Captain Eva Rostova ran her precinct with the efficiency of a battlefield commander. She was a 25-year veteran of the force, a woman who had come up through the ranks when it was twice as hard for a woman to do so. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, with a near-supernatural ability to smell a lie from 100 paces. Her desk was an island of order in the chaotic sea of the precinct. As the shift commander, she was reviewing the day's arrest reports, a routine part of her afternoon. She scanned the digital entries, her eyes moving quickly over the usual assortment of shoplifters, domestic disputes, and minor drug offenses. She clicked on the latest entry, the one filed by Vance and Dolan. The charges were boilerplate: failure to maintain lane, failure to comply with a lawful order, resisting arrest. Rostova frowned slightly. Vance had a reputation. He was aggressive, with a high number of citizen complaints that always seemed to get dismissed as unfounded. He was the kind of cop who saw every interaction as a challenge to his authority. She made a mental note to review his body cam footage later. She scrolled down to the suspect's information. The name was entered simply: Hayes, Arthur. Age, 58. Occupation, left blank. She sighed. Vance was lazy with his paperwork. It was another sign of his sloppy, arrogant approach to the job. She was about to move on to the next report when something about the name snagged her attention. Hayes. Arthur Hayes. Where did she know that name from? Her eyes flicked to the mugshot that had just been uploaded. The image was stark, the lighting harsh. It showed a distinguished-looking black man in his late 50s. His lip was swollen and cut, but his eyes held a look of intense, unshakable composure. There was an intelligence and authority in his gaze that was utterly at odds with the humiliating context of the photograph. The look on his face wasn't one of a common criminal. It was the look of a man who was cataloging a grave error. And then it hit her. It was like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of her. Arthur Hayes. The Honorable Arthur Hayes. She had seen him on the news just this morning, had read his name in the paper a dozen times this week. The landmark civil rights ruling. The federal judge. No, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in her quiet office. It can't be. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the state's public records database. She typed in the name and date of birth from the arrest report. A few seconds later, the result flashed on the screen, confirming her worst fear. There it was, in black and white. Occupation, federal judge, United States District Court. The same man whose photograph was now in her precinct's booking system was one of the most powerful judicial figures in the entire state. The blood drained from Captain Rostova's face. Every instinct, every ounce of her 25 years of experience screamed that this was a catastrophe of monumental proportions. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was the kind of incident that destroyed careers, ended pensions, and brought the full, wrathful power of the Department of Justice down on a precinct. This was a 5-alarm fire, and Vance and Dolan had just doused it with gasoline. She looked at the charges again. Resisting arrest. She thought of Vance's reputation and the look in Judge Hayes's eyes in that mugshot. The narrative was clear to her, as if it were written in giant, flaming letters. Vance had profiled a black man in a nice car, initiated a bogus stop, and when confronted with an identity that challenged his prejudice, he had escalated. He had arrested a federal judge on trumped-up charges, and judging by the cut on his lip, he had likely assaulted him too. A cold, controlled fury began to build within her. This wasn't just about the inevitable political and legal fallout. This was an insult to the badge she had worked her entire life to honor. Vance and Dolan hadn't just arrested a judge, they had betrayed the public trust. They had betrayed their oath, and they had betrayed every good cop who did the job the right way. She stood up, her chair scraping back harshly. Her movements were calm, deliberate, but her eyes held a storm. She walked out of her office and into the main bullpen. "Somebody find me Officers Vance and Dolan," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an edge that made every officer in the room stop what they were doing and look up. "Tell them I want to see them in my office. 5 minutes ago." Vance and Dolan were in the break room grabbing coffee, a cloud of nervous energy hanging between them. Vance was trying to project an air of nonchalant confidence, recounting a version of the arrest that painted him as the hero, but the tremor in his hands betrayed his anxiety. Dolan was silent, stirring his coffee endlessly, his gaze fixed on the swirling brown liquid as if it held the answers to the mess they were in. When the rookie officer came in and delivered Captain Rostova's summons, the false bravado evaporated completely. "The captain wants to see us," Dolan said, his voice barely a whisper. "So?" Vance shot back a little too quickly. "It's probably just about the report. Relax, we've got this." But as they walked down the hall to Rostova's office, even Vance could feel the atmosphere in the precinct had shifted. The normal buzz of activity seemed to quiet as they passed. Eyes followed them. They were no longer just two cops at the end of a shift. They were men being summoned for judgment. Rostova's office door was open. She was standing behind her desk, not sitting. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her expression as hard and unyielding as granite. She waited until they were both inside, then she quietly closed the door behind them. The soft click of the latch sounded like a cell door locking. "Tell me about your arrest," she said, her voice dangerously calm. She didn't look at the report on her desk. She looked directly at them, her eyes moving from Vance to Dolan and back again. Vance launched into his prepared story. Yes, Captain, we initiated a traffic stop on a black Mercedes for failure to maintain lane. The driver immediately became belligerent and uncooperative. He refused to provide his license. Stop, Rostova said. The single word cut through Vance's narrative like a surgeon's scalpel. Just stop. Don't you dare stand in my office and lie to my face. Vance's mouth opened, then closed. He was so used to being the one in command, the one who controlled the narrative, that her direct, immediate challenge left him speechless. Rostova's gaze shifted to Dolan. Officer Dolan, you're newer. You still have a chance to salvage a career. I'm going to ask you one time, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Did the driver refuse to provide his license? Dolan swallowed hard. He glanced at Vance, who shot him a look of pure menace. But the fear of his partner was now eclipsed by the terrifying, ice-cold authority radiating from Captain Rostova. He looked at the floor. No, Captain, he mumbled. He provided it, along with other ID. Other ID? Rostova pressed, her voice like chipping ice. What other ID, Officer Dolan? It was a judicial ID, Dolan stammered. A federal one. Rostova let the admission hang in the air for a moment, the silence amplifying its weight. She then turned her full attention back to Vance, who looked as if he'd been struck. So, Officer Vance, she continued, her voice dripping with contempt, you want to revise your story? You want to tell me why you arrested a man who immediately identified himself as a federal judge? And while you're at it, you can explain the cut on his lip that I saw in the mugshot. Did he get that while he was being belligerent? Vance's face was a mess of conflicting emotions, rage, panic, disbelief that his version of events wasn't being blindly accepted. He was mouthing off. He was challenging my authority. He was reaching for something, he blurted out, the lie flimsy and desperate. Reaching for what, Vance? Rostova shot back, taking a step toward him. His copy of the Constitution? You know we have body cameras, right? You know I'm going to watch the entire recording of this disastrous, career-ending mistake you just made. And when I see that you assaulted a federal judge after he asserted his right to counsel, what do you think is going to happen? The mention of the body camera seemed to finally break Vance. The color drained from his face. He had been so consumed by his own rage during the encounter that the camera on his chest had become an afterthought. Now he realized it had been the primary witness to his crimes. Captain, it was a misunderstanding, he tried, his voice now weak, pleading. No, Rostova said, her voice dropping to a low, furious whisper. A misunderstanding is when you write down the wrong address on a report. What you did was profile, harass, and assault a citizen. The fact that he's a federal judge just turns your bonfire of stupidity into a full-blown nuclear meltdown. You haven't just embarrassed this precinct, you've declared war on the entire judicial system. She pointed a trembling finger toward the door. Both of you, get out of my office. Go to the locker room. Place your badge and your weapon in your locker. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. And pray. Pray that the man you just threw in a holding cell is feeling merciful. The walk from Captain Rostova's office to the locker room was the longest of Vance and Dolan's lives. The silent treatment from their fellow officers was worse than any shouting match. The looks they received were a mixture of pity, contempt, and a kind of morbid curiosity. They were now pariahs, the carriers of a plague that threatened the entire precinct. The blue shield, that unspoken code of solidarity among officers, had not just been breached, it had been shattered. Their actions were so egregious, so far beyond the pale, that no one would or could defend them. Inside the sterile, echoing locker room, the reality of their situation began to set in with the finality of a slamming door. Vance, his face a mask of disbelief, fumbled with the combination on his locker. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Dolan sank onto a bench, put his head in his hands, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. "This is a nightmare," Dolan whispered. "A federal judge, Ryan. How could you not believe him? Shut up, Mike, Vance snapped, but there was no heat in it, only a brittle, cracking fear. He didn't look like a judge. He was supposed to, I don't know, he was supposed to fold. Dolan looked up, his face etched with a dawning, sickening understanding. It was never about the traffic stop, was it? You hated him the second you saw him in that car. Vance didn't answer. He finally got his locker open and stared inside at the life he was about to lose. He slowly unclipped the badge from his uniform. The metal felt cold and heavy in his hand, an alien object. For years it had been a source of power, of identity. Now it was just a piece of evidence. He placed it on the shelf next to his weapon. He unbuckled his duty belt, the familiar weight of it suddenly gone, leaving him feeling exposed and weak. Meanwhile, Captain Rostova moved with the speed and precision of a crisis manager. Her first call was not to her superiors, but to the holding cell block. "Get Arthur Hayes out of that cell, now!" she commanded the booking sergeant. "Bring him to my office, and for God's sake, get him a cup of coffee and some water. Treat him with the respect he is due." Her next call was to the chief of police, a conversation she knew would be excruciating. She laid out the facts without embellishment, her voice a flat, professional monotone that belied the fury churning inside her. The chief was silent for a long moment after she finished, the silence crackling with political and legal implications. His response was swift. "Launch an immediate internal affairs investigation, secure all evidence, including the body cam footage, and offer a full, unconditional apology." When Judge Hayes was escorted into her office, Rostova was standing, her expression a mixture of deep professional shame and personal respect. The judge's suit jacket was returned to him, though it was now wrinkled. He had a bottle of water in his hand. He looked exhausted, but his composure was absolute. "Judge Hayes," she began, her voice tight with sincerity, "on behalf of this department and as the commander of this precinct, I offer you my deepest, most profound apologies. There are no words to describe how utterly unacceptable the actions of my officers were. They are a disgrace to the uniform." The judge looked at her, his eyes assessing, weighing her words. He gave a slight, tired nod. "Thank you, Captain, I appreciate that. Your property will be returned to you immediately. You are, of course, free to go. An officer will drive you back to your vehicle. We have already called for a department tow truck to take your car to a dealership of your choice to have the damage repaired." She paused. "We have also launched a full internal affairs investigation. Officers Vance and Dolan have been suspended, pending termination." "I see," the judge said quietly. "Captain, I need to be clear. An apology, while appreciated, is not the end of this. A civil complaint will be filed, and I will be cooperating fully with the U.S. Attorney's Office should they choose to pursue federal charges for civil rights violations." Rostova didn't flinch. "I would expect nothing less, Judge. You are entitled to pursue every legal remedy available. We will cooperate fully with any and all external investigations." She hesitated for a moment. "If there is anything at all that I can do for you, please, do not hesitate to ask." Judge Hayes looked at the captain, a woman clearly trying to salvage a disaster she did not create. He saw in her the professionalism and integrity that Vance and Dolan so utterly lacked. "Just ensure the truth comes out, Captain," he said. "That's all I ask." With that, he turned and walked out of her office, leaving Captain Rostova alone with the wreckage of her afternoon and the knowledge that the storm was only just beginning. Within 24 hours, the story exploded. It started as a local news alert, then it was picked up by national outlets, and from there it detonated across social media like a firestorm. The initial reports were shocking enough. Federal judge arrested in bogus traffic stop. But it was the release of the body cam footage that turned the story into a national outrage. The police department, under immense pressure from the mayor's office and a tidal wave of public outcry, made the unprecedented decision to release the full, unedited videos from both Vance's and Dolan's cameras. They hoped it would be seen as an act of transparency, a way to get ahead of the narrative. Instead, it was like pouring fuel on a fire. The footage was raw, damning, and undeniable. America watched as Officer Vance manufactured a reason to pull over a luxury car. They heard his mocking, contemptuous tone as he dismissed a federal judge's identification. They saw him toss the credentials back into the car with a flick of his wrist. They witnessed Judge Hayes's calm, patient attempts to de-escalate, and they saw those attempts met with increasing aggression. But the moment that truly galvanized the nation was the shove. The video showed Judge Hayes, hands cuffed behind his back, calmly asserting his right to an attorney. And then it showed Vance, his face contorted in a mask of rage, violently shoving the judge into the hood of the car. The sickening thud of the impact, followed by the horrified gasps of the bystanders who were also filming, was visceral. It was a crystal-clear image of abuse of power, of a man with a badge and a gun assaulting a helpless, restrained citizen. The footage went viral. The hashtags #Judge Hayes and #Justice for Judge Hayes trended for days. News channels played the clip on a loop. Legal analysts broke down the mountain of constitutional violations. Pundits debated the intersection of race, class, and policing. The faces of Vance and Dolan were suddenly everywhere, their sneering contempt and panicked fear becoming symbols of a system that many felt was broken. For Judge Hayes, the experience was surreal. He stayed home, declining all interview requests, letting the legal process he so deeply believed in begin to turn. He watched the news with his wife, Sarah, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie about someone else. But the public reaction was a source of quiet comfort. It showed him that people still recognized injustice when they saw it. They still believed in fairness and accountability. The fallout for the police department was swift and brutal. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs demanding accountability. The chief of police held a grim press conference, announcing the immediate firing of both Vance and Dolan. He promised reforms, more training, a renewed commitment to community policing. But the public was skeptical. They had heard these promises before. For Vance and Dolan, life became a living hell. Their names and addresses were leaked online. They received death threats. They couldn't leave their homes without being recognized and accosted. They were vilified on a national scale, their careers and reputations utterly destroyed. They had been the enforcers, the ones who held power on the streets. Now they were prisoners in their own homes, hiding from the consequences of a few minutes of unchecked prejudice and rage. They learned the hard way that while a body camera records the actions of a citizen, it also records with unblinking and unforgiving clarity the soul of the officer wearing it. And the soul it had revealed to the world was ugly, rotten, and now completely indefensible. The viral truth had set a fire that would culminate not just in a civil lawsuit, but in a criminal courtroom. Months passed. The seasons turned from the bright heat of summer to the crisp chill of autumn. For Judge Hayes, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. He was back on the bench, presiding over cases, his demeanor as calm and measured as ever. But something inside him had changed. When he looked at the police officers testifying in his courtroom, he saw them with new eyes. He listened to the testimony of defendants with a new depth of understanding. His ordeal had not made him bitter. It had made him more empathetic, more keenly aware of the immense power imbalance that existed between the state and the individual. The civil suit against the city and the two former officers had been settled quickly and quietly, with the city offering a substantial sum to avoid a protracted and embarrassing public trial. But the money was never the point for Judge Hayes. The real justice, he knew, would come from the criminal proceedings. The U.S. Attorney's Office had acted decisively. After reviewing the evidence, a grand jury had indicted Ryan Vance and Mike Dolan on multiple federal charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of justice for their falsified police report. The case was assigned to a different district to avoid any conflict of interest, and a trial date was set. On a cold November morning, Arthur Hayes found himself not in his own courtroom, but in the sterile witness waiting room of another federal courthouse. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, the uniform of a witness, not a judge. He was about to do something he hadn't done since he was a young prosecutor: take the witness stand and give testimony. He had spent hours with the federal prosecutors preparing for this day. They had gone over every detail of the arrest, every word spoken, every action taken. They had prepped him for the cross-examination, warning him that the defense attorneys would try to paint him as arrogant, as the one who had escalated the situation, as a man who had used his position to provoke the officers. He wasn't nervous. His entire career had been a preparation for moments like this. He understood the rules of evidence, the art of testimony. His job was simple: to tell the truth clearly and concisely. He sat on the hard wooden bench, his briefcase at his feet, and reviewed his notes one last time. He felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for all the people who had suffered similar injustices without the platform or resources to fight back. He was their voice today. When the bailiff finally called his name, he stood up, straightened his tie, and walked into the courtroom. It was packed. Reporters, legal observers, and concerned citizens filled every seat. At the defense table sat Ryan Vance and Mike Dolan. They looked like different men. The aggressive swagger was gone, replaced by the pale, anxious look of defendants facing the possibility of years in prison. Vance refused to meet his gaze, staring intently at a notepad. Dolan, however, looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. The judge saw in the younger man's face a profound, soul-deep regret. He walked to the witness stand, the familiar geography of a courtroom now seen from a completely new perspective. He raised his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the court clerk asked. "I do," Judge Arthur Hayes replied, his voice calm, clear, and resonant. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the jury. He was no longer the victim. He was a witness for the prosecution, and he was ready to deliver his testimony. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp, composed woman named Maria Flores, began her direct examination. She walked Judge Hayes through the events of that spring afternoon, her questions precise and methodical. She had him describe his drive home, the moment he saw the police cruiser, the pretextual stop. With each answer, the judge painted a clear, dispassionate picture of the encounter. He used no emotional language, no hyperbole. He simply stated the facts as they had occurred. His calm demeanor and meticulous recall made his testimony all the more powerful. He was the ideal witness, credible, articulate, and unshakable. "Judge Hayes," Flores said, her voice echoing slightly in the silent courtroom, "did you at any point resist Officer Vance's commands?" "No, I did not," he replied. "I complied with every lawful and unlawful command he gave." "And when you were placed in handcuffs, did you inform him that you wished to speak with an attorney?" "Yes. I invoked both my Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights clearly and repeatedly." "What was Officer Vance's response to your request for legal counsel?" The judge paused for a fraction of a second, the memory still sharp. "He became enraged. He pulled me from the vehicle and physically assaulted me by shoving me into the hood of my car." A low murmur went through the courtroom gallery. At the defense table, Vance's attorney scribbled furiously on a legal pad. Vance himself sank lower in his chair, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. The cross-examination was as brutal as the prosecutors had predicted. Vance's lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Peterson, tried every trick in the book. He tried to portray the judge as an elitist who looked down on working-class cops. He tried to suggest the judge's knowledge of the law was used to antagonize, not to comply. "Isn't it true, Judge," Peterson asked, his voice dripping with insinuation, "that you began citing case law to the officers? That you were, in effect, trying to show them you were smarter than them?" "No, sir," the judge replied calmly. "I was attempting to remind the officers of the legal boundaries of their authority in the hope of de-escalating the situation and preventing the violation of my constitutional rights." "So you provoked them with your legal knowledge?" "I stated my rights." If an officer is provoked by a citizen stating their rights, then the problem lies with the officer, not the citizen. The argument went back and forth, but Peterson could not land a single blow. The judge was a fortress of logic and composure. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He simply answered each question with the unassailable truth. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came after the judge's testimony was complete. Prosecutor Flores stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution would now like to play the body camera footage from former Officer Vance's uniform." The courtroom lights were dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. A technician hit a key, and suddenly the courtroom was transported back to that sunny highway shoulder. The video was shaky, the audio filled with the rush of passing cars, but the content was utterly devastating. The jury watched, their faces grim, as the events unfolded exactly as Judge Hayes had described. They saw the contemptuous toss of the ID. They heard Vance's escalating aggression. They witnessed the judge's calm pleas for his rights. And then they saw it, the shove. The raw, brutal violence of the act, seen from the attacker's own point of view, was sickening. The collective gasp in the courtroom was audible. The camera kept recording as Vance's heavy breathing filled the audio, the first crack in his armor of rage. The footage didn't just corroborate the judge's testimony, it screamed it from the rooftops. It was the objective, unblinking eye of a witness that could not be cross-examined, could not be intimidated, and could not be made to lie. When the lights came back up, the atmosphere in the courtroom had irrevocably changed. The defense's narrative had been obliterated. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. Everyone in that room, from the jury to the judge on the bench, knew they had just witnessed a crime. Ryan Vance and Mike Dolan stared at the blank screen, their faces ashen. They had just been convicted by a ghost, the ghost of their own actions, preserved forever on a tiny digital chip. The rest of the trial felt like a formality. The defense put up a weak case, calling a use-of-force expert who wilted under the prosecution's cross-examination when confronted with the video. Vance did not take the stand in his own defense. His lawyer knew that putting his rage-filled persona in front of the jury would be disastrous. Dolan, as part of a last-minute deal for a lighter sentence recommendation, took the stand and gave a halting, shame-faced account that confirmed every detail of the prosecution's case. He recounted how Vance had manufactured the reason for the stop and had been determined to make an arrest from the very beginning. His testimony was the final nail in the coffin. After the closing arguments, the prosecution's a calm, factual recitation of the overwhelming evidence, the defense's a desperate plea for the jury to see a misunderstanding rather than malice, the case went to the jury. The wait for the verdict was tense. Judge Hayes was not in the courtroom. He was in the U.S. Attorney's office nearby waiting with the prosecution team. He sat by a window looking out at the city skyline, feeling a sense of profound closure, regardless of the outcome. He had told his truth. The system he had served for so long would now have to do its part. He didn't have to wait long. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The speed of their decision sent a clear signal. Judge Hayes and the prosecutors returned to the packed courtroom. The air was electric with anticipation. Vance and Dolan were brought in and stood beside their lawyers at the defense table. Vance was ramrod straight, his jaw clenched, a final futile mask of defiance. Dolan was visibly trembling, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The jury filed in, their faces solemn. None of them looked at the defendants. It was another ominous sign. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreman and handed it to the judge, who reviewed it silently before handing it back. "In the matter of the United States versus Ryan Vance," the clerk began, his voice booming in the hushed room, "on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant—" He paused, drawing out the moment. "Guilty." A wave of emotion washed through the courtroom. A quiet sob escaped from a woman in the gallery, Vance's wife. Vance himself flinched as if he'd been physically struck, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The clerk continued. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ryan Vance, guilty. He then read the verdicts for Dolan, who was also found guilty on all counts, though his cooperation would be taken into account later. It was over. The legal battle that had begun with a momentary swerve on a sunny parkway had ended here, with the unequivocal pronouncement of guilt. Justice, methodical and relentless, had prevailed. As the judge ordered the two disgraced former officers to be taken into custody pending sentencing, Arthur Hayes felt not a sense of triumph or revenge, but a deep, solemn vindication. The system, for all its flaws and imperfections, had worked. The rule of law, the principle to which he had dedicated his life, had been affirmed. The weight of the gavel, in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens, had come down on the side of truth. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the interim, a stunning and unprecedented legal development occurred. The presiding judge on the case, citing the need to avoid even the appearance of impropriety given his long-standing professional relationship with Judge Hayes, announced his intention to recuse himself from the sentencing phase. In a motion that shocked the legal community, the prosecution, with the grudging consent of the defense attorneys who saw it as a potential Hail Mary for a lighter sentence, petitioned for Judge Arthur Hayes himself to be appointed to preside over the sentencing. The legal arguments were complex, touching on judicial temperament, victim impact, and the very nature of impartiality. But the core of the motion was simple. Who better to understand the gravity of the crime than the man who had endured it? Who better to weigh the betrayal of public trust than a man who embodied that trust? After careful consideration, the chief judge of the district approved the motion. The story was about to come full circle in the most dramatic way imaginable. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was overflowing. The story had become a national symbol of accountability, and this final act was the one everyone was waiting for. Ryan Vance and Mike Dolan, now dressed in drab prison jumpsuits, were led to the defense table. They looked pale and diminished, stripped of the authority that had once defined them. Then, a hush fell over the room as the bailiff announced, "All rise!" Judge Arthur Hayes entered the courtroom, not from the witness stand, but from the door behind the bench. He ascended the steps and took his seat, the black robe settling around him like a mantle of immense authority. He looked out over the courtroom, his eyes calm and steady. He glanced at the two men who had arrested him, cuffed him, and assaulted him. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound and weary sadness. He allowed the attorneys to make their final statements. The prosecutor argued for a significant prison sentence, citing the egregious abuse of power. The defense attorneys pleaded for leniency, speaking of their clients' families, their prior service, and their deep remorse. Then, it was time. Judge Hayes looked down at the two men standing before him. He did not read from a prepared statement. He spoke from the heart, his voice filling the silent room. "This court is a place of law, but it is also a place of understanding," he began. "I have spent a great deal of time contemplating the events that brought us all here today. I have tried to understand what motivates a man to betray his oath, to abuse the power vested in him by the people he has sworn to protect." He looked at Vance. "Mr. Vance, your actions were not born of a single mistake or a moment of poor judgment. They were the product of a deep-seated prejudice, a corrosive belief that your authority gave you the right to be judge, jury, and executioner on the side of a highway. You saw a man who did not fit your worldview, and you sought to punish him for it. You wrapped your personal resentments in the flag of law enforcement, and in doing so, you dishonored both." He then turned to Dolan. "Mr. Dolan, your crime was one of silence. You stood by and watched an injustice unfold. You knew it was wrong, and yet you did nothing. Your inaction enabled the aggression of your partner. Let this be a lesson. In the machinery of injustice, the bystander is as crucial a component as the perpetrator." He paused, letting his words sink in. The damage you have done extends far beyond one man's afternoon. You have eroded the fragile trust between the community and law enforcement. You have given ammunition to those who believe the system is irredeemably broken. And you have tarnished the reputation of the thousands of good, honorable officers who do their job with integrity every single day. He picked up the gavel. But our system, for all its flaws, is also resilient. It has the capacity for correction. It has the capacity for justice. He delivered Dolan's sentence first. 2 years in a federal prison, a sentence lightened by his cooperation. Then, he looked at Ryan Vance. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice imbued with the full weight of the law. "For your crimes, for your abuse of power, for your violation of the sacred trust placed in you, this court sentences you to 7 years in federal prison." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. It was the sound of a final, binding judgment. As the marshals led the 2 men away, one shamefaced, the other in stunned disbelief, Judge Hayes sat for a moment in the silence. He had been the victim, the witness, and finally, the judge. Justice had not only been done, it had been embodied. As the courtroom emptied and a quiet stillness returned, Judge Hayes remained on the bench, lost in thought. The gavel felt heavy in his hand, a symbol not of victory, but of a grim, necessary duty fulfilled. He found himself dissecting the very beginning of the encounter, trying to pinpoint the origin of the poison. What led Officer Vance down that path? It wasn't just a bad day, it was a worldview built on a foundation of insecurity and prejudice. Vance saw a black man in a luxury car, and his mind couldn't process it as success. It could only see it as a threat, an aberration, something that needed to be put back in its place. His aggression wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about enforcing his own fragile sense of order in a world he felt was leaving him behind. His badge wasn't a tool for justice, it was a shield for his own inadequacies. He wondered, what if he had reacted differently? What if he had met Vance's aggression with his own anger? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Had he yelled? Had he argued? Had he made any sudden moves, the entire narrative would have shifted. The body cam footage would have shown 2 angry men shouting, not one calm man being victimized. His restraint, a product of years of judicial temperament and stoic practice, had been his most powerful weapon. It had allowed the unvarnished truth of Vance's behavior to stand on its own, without any justification or mitigation. The greatest defense, he realized, was to be so unlike your aggressor that their malice becomes undeniably clear. This incident, as harrowing as it was, underscored a profound truth. The oath to uphold the law is not a passive pledge. It is an active, moment-to-moment choice. For every officer like Vance, there are thousands who make the right choice every day, who de-escalate, who listen, who serve with honor. The tragedy is that the actions of one can cast a shadow over the integrity of many. The law is only as strong as the character of those who enforce it. When that character fails, the entire structure of justice is threatened. But when the system is allowed to correct itself, when accountability is delivered, that structure is reinforced, made stronger, and trust, however fragile, can begin to be rebuilt. What do you think was the most critical mistake Vance and Dolan made during the stop? Do you believe the final sentence was just? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please subscribe for more stories where justice, in the end, finds its voice.